Bruce Springsteen is one of the greatest artists in the history of American music. The man who shaped the sound of an entire generation with his blend of rock, folk, and raw stories about the working class. With more than 150 million records sold worldwide, he is not just a star, but a cultural icon. Albums like Born to Run, Darkness on the Edge of Town, and especially Born in the USA, took his name to the very top, with Born in the USA selling more than 30 million copies and spawning 7 songs that hit the Billboard Top 10. He has won 20 Grammy Awards, an Oscar for the song Streets of Philadelphia, along with many other prestigious honors such as the Golden Globe, and was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, one of the highest honors given to an American citizen. Not only successful in the studio, Bruce Springsteen is also considered one of the greatest live performers of all time, with shows that stretch for hours alongside the E Street Band, where he turns every stage into an intense emotional experience, connecting directly with tens of thousands of fans and creating a legacy that is measured not just by numbers, but by its profound impact on American culture and music. But behind those numbers and titles is a man who has spent his whole life facing battles no one could see. A long-lasting depression that followed him like a shadow, rooted in a childhood full of tension with a cold and distant father, where he learned to stay silent instead of being heard, even standing in front of tens of thousands of cheering people. There were moments when he still felt completely alone, as if everything around him was just an echo from an emptiness inside. He went through periods of mental breakdown, had to turn to therapy to keep himself from falling too deep, and lived with the fear that he would become exactly the father he could never understand. Yet what makes Bruce Springsteen different is not that he never fell, but that he kept getting back up, kept stepping onto the stage, kept singing, not because he had overcome it all, but because he chose to keep living with those wounds, turning them into music, into connection, and into a reason not to disappear. Before we continue with the story, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a quiet way to pay tribute to the man who has spent his whole life raising his voice for hearts that no one listens to. And if you have ever found yourself in a melody by Bruce Springsteen, please stay until the end. Because behind those songs is a story that not everyone is strong enough to face. Bruce Springsteen was not born into the spotlight or big dreams. He grew up in a house where affection was rarely spoken out loud, where silence sometimes felt heavier than any scolding, and where a child had to learn on his own that love did not always come in ways that were easy to recognize. In the small town of Freehold, New Jersey, life revolved around manual labor. Long, exhausting days and evenings stretched out in an atmosphere of tension that no one dared to name. His father, Douglas Springsteen, was a man carrying shadows inside him that in those days no one called depression. He spoke little, often sat quietly in the dim light of the kitchen, the faint lamp shining on his thoughtful face but never explaining anything, and in the eyes of young Bruce, it was not just silence. It was a distance he could not cross, with no words of encouragement, no pat on the shoulder, only the feeling that he was always standing somewhere beyond the reach of recognition. There were evenings when father and son sat facing each other without saying a word, and it was in those very moments that Bruce learned that sometimes existing meant shrinking yourself, staying silent long enough not to become a burden to others. The feeling of not being seen, not being understood, slowly soaked into him like an unchangeable truth, and from a very early age he began to believe that his worth was not something given, but something that had to be earned, had to be proven, had to be fought for. His mother, Adele, was the rare light in that house. She worked non-stop, brought home small paychecks, and tried to keep the family from falling apart. But no matter how hard she tried, there were still gaps that she alone could not fill, because love, when it is not spoken, sometimes becomes invisible to a child who is starving for recognition. Bruce did not grow up with affirmations that he was good enough. He grew up with doubt, with the quiet question repeating in his head about whether he was worthy or not, and that very question followed in throughout his life, never truly leaving. School was not a place of escape either. He was not an outstanding student, not someone who stood out, just a quiet boy on the edge of everything, observing the world but never really belonging to it. And in the middle of all that, music began to appear not as a dream, but as a way to survive, as the only place where he could say the things he could never speak in real life. When he held the guitar, when he sang those first melodies, he was no longer the forgotten child in a silent room. He became someone with a voice, even if only for a moment, and from that, a belief took shape, that if he could sing loud enough and true enough, then maybe one day the world would listen. Maybe one day he would no longer feel invisible. But what that boy did not know was that no matter how many people listened, the feeling of not being loved from those early years would stay with him, like a wound that never truly healed, only learned to hide itself deeper with time. After those years growing up in heavy silence and the feeling of not belonging anywhere, Bruce Springsteen entered his teenage years with one thing that made him feel he existed more clearly: music. But even that did not begin like the bright dream people usually tell about. It came as a survival instinct, a way to escape the feeling of being swallowed by mediocrity and invisibility. The first time he saw Elvis Presley on television, it was not a moment of simple admiration, but like a door opening in his mind, where he realized there could be another way to exist, a way to be seen, to be heard, and from then on, the guitar was not just an instrument. It became a life preserver, the only thing keeping him afloat when everything else seemed to be pulling him under. Bruce no longer cared about school, not because he lacked ability, but because he could not find meaning in what others called the right path. He started neglecting his studies, spending most of his time playing music, practicing, and looking for small chances to perform. A decision that in many people's eyes was reckless, even doomed from the start, because he had no money, no connections, no clear plan, only a vague urge he could not even explain. Those years were a series of days wandering through small bars in New Jersey, where the lights were dim, the cigarette smoke was thick, and the few audience members usually were not really listening. There were nights he sang for a handful of people drinking alcohol, people who did not remember his name, did not remember the songs, and sometimes did not even remember that someone had stood there pouring his heart out. But Bruce kept going, not because he was sure of success, but because he did not know how to stop, because stopping meant going back to the feeling of invisibility he had tried to escape since he was a child. He joined many different bands, from the Castiles to lesser-known small groups, moving from one place to another with no stability, no guarantee, only long roads, late nights, and a loneliness that was hard to name. There were times he wondered what he was really searching for, whether there was actually a destination ahead, or if it was all just an endless loop. But every time that question appeared, he would pick up the guitar again and keep going, as if music was the only thing that could keep him from being pulled back into the old emptiness. What made this journey different was not the desire for glory, but the fear, a deep fear that if he stopped, if he accepted a normal life, he would disappear in a way no one would notice, that he would become someone like his father, sitting in silence, carrying things that were never spoken. And it was that very fear that pushed him farther than any dream ever could. Night after night, stage after small stage, song after imperfect song, Bruce Springsteen was not just building a career, he was trying to build a reason to exist, a way to prove that his presence in this world was not a mistake. But what he had not yet realized was that no matter how far he ran, no matter how loud he sang, the things he was running from were still traveling with him, quietly, patiently, waiting. After those years wandering through dark bars where Bruce Springsteen's guitar often drowned in the clinking of glasses and half-finished conversations, a door finally opened, not with bright lights, but with a fragile opportunity that was enough to change the direction of his life. When he signed a contract with Columbia Records in the early 1970s, a step forward that any young artist would dream of. But for Bruce, it did not feel like a victory. It felt like being pushed into a world he had never truly been ready to face. Because as soon as he stepped into the recording studio, everything began to change. No longer the free nights of playing music, no longer the feeling of existing in his own way, but invisible yet heavy expectations pressing down on his shoulders from the record label, from the producers, from the industry itself that was looking for a new star, someone who could be shaped, sold, and placed into a mold they believed was right. And in that process, Bruce began to feel clearly something he had never faced before, that getting closer to success did not always make him feel lighter, but sometimes that very step forward made him feel more estranged from himself. His debut album, Greetings from Asbury Park in Jersey, released in 1973, was not a failure. But it was not the success the industry had expected either. It received attention from critics, but did not create a big commercial splash, and right away the pressure started to build. No longer the question of whether he could do it, but whether he could do it fast enough, whether he could prove his worth before this opportunity disappeared. Bruce entered the second album with a sense of urgency, as if every song was not just music, but a plea for his existence in this industry. But the harder he tried, the more he realized he was being pulled in different directions, between keeping the honesty in his music and meeting what others expected, between being himself and becoming the version the market could accept. And in that tug-of-war, the feeling of unease did not disappear. It only changed shape, from the fear of being invisible to the fear of being seen but not understood, from the fear of not existing to the fear of existing in the wrong way. As attention began to grow, as his name started being mentioned more, Bruce did not feel more confident. On the contrary, he felt like he was being placed under a light that was too bright, where every weakness, every doubt, became clearer than ever. And the scariest thing was not others judging him, but that he himself began to doubt who he was in the middle of all that. The long recording sessions, the meetings, the decisions about sound, about image, about direction, all gradually blurred the original feeling he had with music. The thing that had once been a refuge now became a battlefield, where he had to constantly fight to keep a part of himself from being swept away. And in that process, a truth began to form, slowly but unavoidably, that the farther he went down this road, the more he lost connection with the very person he had tried to protect from the beginning, that success was not a destination, but a state full of contradictions, where he was seen more than ever before and felt more lost than ever before. And in the silence between the applause that had not yet arrived, Bruce Springsteen began to understand that this journey would never be simple, that every step forward would carry a price, and that price was not always measurable by what others could see. The turning point came so fast that even Bruce Springsteen himself could barely understand what was happening. When Born to Run was released in 1975, everything changed in a single moment that should have been a dream, but instead felt like a flood carrying him far away from himself. From an artist still trying to find his footing, he became a name mentioned everywhere, appearing simultaneously on the covers of Time magazine and Newsweek, something rare that not everyone achieved. And overnight, Bruce was no longer the one searching for a path. He was placed straight at the top of something he had not yet prepared to carry. The title, The Voice of America, came to him like a coronation, but also as a burden no one asked if he was ready for, because from that moment on, he was no longer singing just for himself. He had to sing for an entire generation, had to carry the expectations, the beliefs, the dreams that millions of people placed on his shoulders, and the irony was that the more he was seen, the more he lost the ability to be himself. The spotlight did not open up freedom. It closed off every escape, because when all eyes were on you, there was nowhere left to hide. No space to make mistakes, no chance to stay silent. Every move, every word, every song was watched, analyzed, assigned meanings that sometimes even he did not recognize. People saw a legend rising, a symbol of hope, of strength, of America. But inside, Bruce only saw a man slowly losing himself. A man no longer sure which voice was truly his amid all the noise around him. Born to Run was supposed to be a door opening to freedom, but it became an invisible frame holding him inside an image he had to keep maintaining. Because when you are loved for something, you start to fear losing it, and that fear makes you keep playing the role, keep being the version everyone expects, even when it no longer truly reflects who you really are. Bruce began to feel clearly that success was not the end of the journey, but the beginning of a new struggle, where he had to constantly balance between keeping his honesty and meeting expectations, between saying what he truly felt and saying what the world wanted to hear, and in that process, a distance formed, not between him and the audience, but between him and himself. There were moments standing on stage amid thousands of cheers when he felt like he was watching himself from the outside, as if the person everyone was cheering for was not completely him, but some version created from the lights, from the music, from what others needed. And when the show ended, when the lights went out, when the applause faded, what remained was not satisfaction but a deeper emptiness, because the higher you climb, the greater the distance when you fall. And Bruce began to understand that fame was not something that freed him from what he had once felt. It only changed the shape of those feelings, from invisibility to being exposed, from not being seen to being seen too much, but never truly understood. He was no longer the boy trying to be recognized. He had become the person everyone thought they already knew, and that very thing made him feel lonelier than ever. Because when the world believes they know who you are, you almost have no chance left to discover that for yourself. And in the silence between the resounding successes, Bruce Springsteen began to realize a truth no one had told him before. That there are prisons without walls, without bars, but that still hold you perfectly. And sometimes the very life you worked so hard to build becomes the place where you feel the most trapped. After the overwhelming success of Born to Run, Bruce Springsteen did not just become a star. He was placed into a much larger role, becoming the voice of working-class Americans, people who carried dreams but also bore disappointment on their shoulders, people he had written about from his own experiences. But what Bruce could not foresee was that when the world started calling him the voice of America, they were not just listening to his music. They began to define him. They began to assign meanings to him that sometimes even he did not recognize. His songs, which had been written from inner conflicts and unanswered questions, gradually got simplified into slogans, into more easily understood and consumable symbols. And especially with Born in the USA, a song that carried inner struggle, pain, and deep criticism, it was misunderstood as a powerful patriotic anthem, a misunderstanding that Bruce could not control. And the more he tried to explain, the more he realized that once the music belonged to the public, it no longer fully belonged to him. That created a very deep feeling of helplessness. Because he was no longer the only one deciding the story of his own work, he became an image that millions of people looked at, each seeing something different, but few truly saw the real person behind it. And along with that came an ever-growing pressure, the pressure to represent, to speak for others, to stand firm as a symbol without being allowed to waver, because when you become someone else's belief, you almost have no right to be weak, no space to collapse. Bruce began to feel clearly that he was not just living his own life, but living inside other people's expectations. And that made every step heavier, every decision more difficult, because any mistake was no longer just a personal mistake, but could shake the image he had been placed into. There were moments when he wanted to stop, wanted to withdraw from it all, But the very role he carried made that almost impossible, because millions of people were still listening, still waiting, still searching in his music for something that helped them keep going. And Bruce could not turn his back on that, even when he himself was struggling to find reasons for his own life. The irony was that the more he was celebrated, the more he felt alienated from himself, because the image the world saw became clearer and clearer while the real person inside became more and more blurred. He began to wonder whether he was still the person who once stood in small bars with a guitar and a simple longing to be heard, or whether he had become something bigger, but also more foreign. Fame, which many people saw as freedom, felt to Bruce like an invisible cage, without bars, without locks, but still holding him perfectly, because he could not step out without losing everything he had built, and he could not stay without feeling like he was gradually disappearing. There were nights after the show ended, when the applause had died down and the lights had gone out. He sat alone and realized that the distance between him and himself had never been so great, that he could stand in front of tens of thousands of people and make them feel understood. But he could not do that for himself. And in that silence, Bruce Springsteen began to understand that the price of becoming the voice for others was sometimes losing the ability to listen to himself. And that was a price that no award, no title could ever compensate for. While the world continued to see an unshakable icon, Bruce Springsteen's personal life began to crack in the quietest way when he entered marriage with Julianne Phillips amid the glare of fame. Amid the applause that had not yet settled and the expectations still pouring toward him, everything started like a dream that many believed was the well-deserved reward for someone who had gone through so many hardships. But what no one saw was that Bruce entered that marriage not with a peaceful heart, but with all the cracks that had never been healed, with a person still trying to understand himself, and with a schedule that never stopped, where long tours, back-to-back recording sessions, and unavoidable obligations gradually created a distance that neither of them could control. At first, they tried to hold everything together. Hurried phone calls between cities, brief meetings, promises to spend more time together when things settled down. But when things settled down, never seemed to arrive, because for Bruce, everything was always in motion. There was always another show, another project, another responsibility. And over time, the small gaps gradually became large, empty spaces, not because they no longer cared, but because they were no longer truly present in each other's lives. The painful thing was not the arguments, because they were not even close enough to argue, but the prolonged silence, the silence in which each began to live their own life even while still carrying the title of husband and wife. Bruce realized something he had never learned from his childhood, that loving someone was not just emotion, but presence. It was staying when things became difficult, but that was exactly what he did not know how to do, because from when he was small, he had learned to run away from emotions that made him uncomfortable. And now, when facing a relationship that demanded patience, sharing, and stopping, he continued to do the only thing he knew: keep going, keep working, keep avoiding the silences he did not know how to fill. And gradually, that marriage did not end in a dramatic moment, but dissolved like something worn down over time, no longer strong enough to hold together. When they finally parted, there were no big accusations, no loud scenes, only the quiet truth that their love had not been enough to withstand the distance life had created. And for Bruce, that breakup was not just losing someone, but facing a part of himself he had never understood, that he was not only afraid of being abandoned, but also afraid of staying long enough to truly face a relationship. And when the marriage ended, he did not find the release many thought he would, but only felt a larger emptiness. An emptiness that no stage, no applause could fill, because for the first time he could not blame the circumstances, could not say he had no choice. He had to face the truth that sometimes the very way he had learned to survive was what made him lose the most important things. And in the silence after a broken marriage, Bruce Springsteen began to understand that there are losses that do not come from not having enough, but from not knowing how to hold on when you already have it. After the broken marriage that left an emptiness no success could fill, Bruce Springsteen turned back to the only thing he knew how to hold on to: the stage. But this time, everything was different. The performances were no longer simply where he found release, but became a duty that had to be fulfilled. An endless loop between light and darkness, where he stood in front of tens of thousands of people, heard them calling his name, saw their raised arms and glowing faces. But inside, he gradually became empty. The music still played, every note still precise, every lyric still full of emotion for the audience. But for him, there were moments when everything felt like mechanical motion, as if he was performing a role he had known by heart for too long. There were nights he stepped onto the stage with all the energy the audience expected, running, jumping, singing, connecting, as if he was living fully in every second. But when the lights went out, when the applause died down, what remained was not a feeling of victory, but a heavy silence, a lingering emptiness that no sound could fill. He returned to his room, sat alone, and realized that what had just happened no longer gave him what it once did, no longer the feeling that he had done something meaningful, only accumulated exhaustion, both physical and mental, as if every show took away a part of his energy that he did not know how to recover. And it was in those moments that a question began to appear. At first very small, almost inaudible, but over time it grew louder, clearer, impossible to ignore. The question about the meaning of everything he was doing, that if he could stand in front of tens of thousands of people, make them feel connected and understood, but could not feel that for himself, then what did all of this really mean? That if success did not bring peace, if recognition did not bring a sense of fullness, then what was he running toward? And more terrifyingly, he began to realize that he had no answer, that the path he had gone too far down to turn back, but he also did not know what lay ahead. And while the world continued to love him, continued to see him as a symbol of strength and resilience, Bruce felt himself drifting further from that very person, because the more he was loved, the more isolated he felt, not because he lacked people around him, but because no one truly saw the exhausted human being inside who was gradually breaking down. No one saw the moments when he doubted himself, the times when he was no longer sure whether he even wanted to continue, and what kept him going was not firm belief but habit, responsibility, the fear that if he stopped, he would have to face everything he had tried to avoid for so long. And so he continued to step onto the stage, continued to sing, continued to do what the world expected, even as every step grew heavier, every song harder to deliver. Because sometimes the hardest thing was not standing in front of thousands of people and performing, but standing alone afterward and facing the silence with no way to escape. After those nights standing in front of tens of thousands of people but returning to heavy silence, Bruce Springsteen began to face something he had tried to run from since he was a boy in that tense house in New Jersey, that the darkness did not disappear when you ran far enough. It only waited until you were tired to return more clearly, more heavily, and this time it was no longer a vague feeling, but became an inseparable part of his life. Depression did not arrive like a big storm visible from afar. It crept in quietly, silently, persistently. There were days he still worked, still performed, still smiled and talked, but inside everything seemed slowed down, heavier, as if every thought had to pass through a thick fog, and there were periods when he could not explain why he felt that way, with no specific reason, no clear event, only a spreading emptiness that made everything lose its color, lose its meaning. The scariest thing was not the sadness, but the numbness, when the things that once made him live fully no longer touched him. The songs, the stages, the applause, they were all still there, but no longer brought the feeling they once did. And in those moments, Bruce began to see the image of his father appear more clearly than ever. The man who once sat silently in the darkness, carrying things that were never spoken. And his greatest fear was no longer failure or being forgotten, but becoming that very person. Repeating the cycle he had tried to escape his whole life, the feeling of losing control began to seep into every aspect, not external control but internal, when he no longer trusted his own emotions, no longer knew what was real and what was just part of a state he could not control. There were times he felt like he was standing outside his own life, watching everything happen without truly participating, a feeling so alien that it made him doubt his own existence. And in the worst moments he realized that if he did nothing, if he kept pretending everything was fine, he could slip deeper into a place he was not sure he could return from. And that was when he was forced to do something he had never thought of before, to seek help, to seek therapy, not because he believed it would fix everything, but because he knew he could not continue like this alone. The therapy sessions did not bring immediate answers, did not erase what had happened, but they forced him to face the things he had avoided, forced him to look directly at the memories, the fears, the parts of himself he had tried to hide with music, with work, with non-stop busyness, and in that process a truth gradually emerged, slowly but undeniable, that there were battles that could not be won in the way he once thought, that there would not be a day when he woke up and everything disappeared, that depression was not an enemy that could be completely defeated, but a part of life he had to learn to live with. This did not bring relief, but a much harder form of acceptance, because it demanded that he give up the idea that one day everything would become easy, that he accept there would still be heavy days, difficult days, days full of doubt. But the difference was that he began to understand that continuing was not because he had won, but because he chose not to let those things completely define him. And in that awareness, even if it was not bright light, at least he found a reason not to stop. A reason to keep moving forward even when every step still felt heavy. After beginning to face the darkness inside and accepting that there were battles that could not be won the way he once thought, Bruce Springsteen stepped into a new chapter of his life, not with complete confidence, but with the caution of someone who had lost too much. And it was precisely in that fragile period that the relationship between him and Patty Alpha gradually became clearer. But not in the way of a simple romantic story. It began amid arguments, suspicious glances from the public, and the wounds from the previous marriage that had not yet healed. Patty did not come to him in an easy time. She entered Bruce's life while he was still struggling with himself, still trying to understand what had happened, and that very thing gave this relationship a weight that neither could ignore. It was no longer youthful love, no longer impulsive and unconditionally emotions, but a conscious choice, a decision to stay even knowing the road ahead would not be easy. Bruce was no longer the man who could run from things that made him uncomfortable. At least he no longer wanted to continue that way. And Patty, with her patience and understanding, did not try to change him, did not try to erase his past, but accepted that those wounds were part of the man she chose to be with. They began to rebuild their life from the broken pieces, not by denying what had happened, but by learning to live with it, one day at a time, one moment at a time. There were times when everything became difficult, when the old shadows returned, when Bruce fell into states he himself could not explain. And in those moments, Patty did not leave, did not turn away, but stayed, not to fix things, but to be present. And that very presence became something Bruce had never truly had before. A feeling that he did not have to face it all alone, but that did not mean everything became easy. Because this love was not a miracle that could erase what had existed for many years, it did not heal completely, did not remove the fears, did not make everything perfect. It only created a space where he could continue without pretending he was okay. Bruce learned to stay, not because he was no longer afraid, but because he understood that leaving was no longer the solution. He learned to face difficult conversations, to face silences he would have avoided before, learned to accept that loving someone was not about always feeling good, but about being there even when things were not good. And in that process, he gradually realized that real love was not something that appeared to save you from yourself, but something that gave you the strength to keep facing yourself. Patty became a support, but not a solution. She did not replace what Bruce had lost, did not completely fill the empty spaces, but she was there, steady and constant, like something he could lean on when everything else felt uncertain. And that, even if imperfect, became one of the most real things in his life, because for the first time, Bruce Springsteen was not only running from the darkness, but beginning to learn how to live with it, and to stay long enough to understand that some things did not need to be completely fixed in order to still exist. When life gradually became more stable beside Patty Scialfa, Bruce Springsteen stepped into a role he both longed for and feared the most, becoming a father, not as a new chapter separate from the past, but as a place where the past returned more clearly than ever, because for the first time in his life he was not only living for himself, but had to become a model for the children who looked at him the way he once looked at his own father. And that very thing made the deepest fear begin to rise, the fear that no matter how hard he tried, he might still repeat what he had been through, might still become a silent and distant father carrying shadows his children could not understand. Bruce did not step into this role with the confidence of someone who was ready, but with the anxiety of someone who knew he had never truly understood himself. And so every moment became more important. Every action became a conscious choice. He tried to be present, not just physically, but emotionally. Tried to listen, tried to say the things he had never heard before, but that was not always easy, because the old shadows did not disappear just because he had a new family. They were still there, sometimes appearing on days when he felt tired, in moments when he could not explain why he became distant. And it was in those times that he realized being a father was not about becoming a perfect version, but about constantly facing the unfinished parts of himself. Family moments, even small ones, became more precious than ever. Meals together, simple conversations, times sitting beside each other without needing to say much, all carried a meaning he had never recognized before. But at the same time, they were fragile, because Bruce understood that just one step back, one moment of not being present, and he could recreate the very distance he had once endured. And that kept him living in a state of both love and constant worry, because love for his children brought not only joy, but also an unending fear. The fear that he would not be enough, that he would miss what was important, that one day his children would look at him with the same question he had carried his whole life. Bruce gradually understood that becoming a father did not erase the past, did not make the memories disappear, but only placed him in a position where he had to face them in a different way, no longer as a child trying to understand, but as an adult trying not to repeat it. And in that process, he learned something no stage could teach. That love was not about guaranteeing everything would always be okay, but about being there, time after time, even when you were not sure you were doing it right. Bruce Springsteen did not become a perfect father, and perhaps he never believed that was possible. But he kept trying, not to fix the past, but to create something different, something his children could carry without feeling what he had once felt. And it was in that imperfect effort that perhaps for the first time in his life, he was not only running from what he feared, but stopping long enough to change the way the story continued. After learning to stay in the family and trying to become a better father than what he had experienced, Bruce Springsteen still did not leave the stage, because that was the only place where he felt he could breathe fully. But it was also the place where the cost of many decades of suppression began to show clearly. Decades of performing with non-stop intensity, tours stretching across cities and continents, nights when energy had to stay at its highest no matter how the body felt, all accumulated like a debt that at some point the body had to collect. At first, only small signs, periods of fatigue that lasted longer than usual. Times when his voice no longer responded as before, days that needed more time to recover. But Bruce was used to pushing through, used to pushing himself beyond limits, used to treating exhaustion as part of the job. And so he continued stepping onto the stage, continued singing, continued doing what he had done his whole life, until the body no longer allowed him to ignore it. When health problems became clearer and more serious, forcing him to stop, not because he wanted to, but because he had no choice. The postponed tours, the announcements that worried fans, all became a reality he had never truly faced before, that there was a limit even willpower could not overcome. And for the first time, Bruce had to look directly at that, had to accept that his body was no longer what it once was. That time had left an irreversible mark. This was not only a physical challenge, but a hard blow to his identity. Because for many years, he had not only been a songwriter, but a performer, a man who lived on stage, a man who defined himself through the ability to stand in front of thousands of people and deliver non-stop energy. And when that was threatened, he did not just lose part of his work, but lost part of himself. There were moments he stood between two choices, and neither was easy: to continue and accept the risk, or to stop and face the emptiness he had never learned how to fill. And what made everything harder was that he did not know how to stop, did not know how to live without the familiar rhythm of tours, of performances, of nights when he felt he existed most clearly. Stopping was not just rest, but a complete change he had never prepared for. And while his body forced him to slow down, his mind still tried to keep going, creating a tug-of-war with no clear solution. Bruce began to realize something he had always avoided before. The time was no longer on his side, that the years ahead were no longer infinite as before, that every decision now carried a different weight, no longer just about what to do next, but about how much time was left to do it. And this awareness did not bring peace, but a feeling of urgency mixed with helplessness, because he could not go back, could not redo, could not reclaim what had passed. He could only keep moving forward with what remained, but the road ahead was no longer the same. It was slower, heavier, and full of questions he was not sure he could answer. And in all of that, Bruce Springsteen began to understand that there were limits not to overcome, but to accept. But that acceptance might be one of the hardest things he had ever had to learn, because it demanded that he let go of a part of himself he had relied on his whole life. And for a man who had lived by never stopping, learning how to stop was sometimes harder than any challenge before. After being forced to slow down before the limits his body no longer allowed him to ignore, Bruce Springsteen faced a silence he had avoided for decades by using music, the stage, and constant motion. And it was in that silence that he began to do something he had never truly been ready for before, looking back at his entire life honestly, without avoidance, without embellishment, without trying to turn the wounds into more acceptable stories. Writing the memoir, Born to Run, was not just a project, but a process of digging deep into memories he had kept buried for too long, where he had to face his childhood, the silent evenings with the father he had never truly understood, the feelings of not being recognized that had followed him his whole life. And what made the process difficult was not remembering but accepting that those things could not be changed. That no matter how far he had gone or how much he had achieved, what had shaped him was still there, not disappearing, not erased by fame or success. Bruce did not write to justify himself, did not try to explain that everything happened for some acceptable reason. He wrote with an honesty that was sometimes almost brutal, admitting the mistakes, the choices that, if he could go back, he might have made differently. Admitting there were times he had not been there when needed, that there were relationships he had not known how to keep, that there were parts of his life that had passed he could not reclaim. And in that process, one truth became clearer than ever. that life was not a story that could be rearranged to become whole, not a journey with a clear beginning and a perfect ending, but a series of pieces that never quite fit together completely. There were cracks that no matter how hard he tried, he could not fully mend. There were questions he had carried for many years, but still had no answers for. And the hardest thing was not failing to find answers, but accepting that perhaps there would never be any. Bruce began to understand that success had no power to change the past. It did not turn back time, did not make what had happened less painful. It only placed him in a position where he could look back at everything from a different angle. But that angle did not make the truth gentler, only clearer, and in that clarity he did not find release but a form of acceptance, a form of peace that did not come from everything becoming good, but from stopping the effort to turn it into something else. Looking back at his life did not give him a feeling of completion, did not bring a clear conclusion that everything had meaning, but only showed him that there were parts of life that would always remain unfinished, emotions that would always stay there, not disappearing with time, and that very thing made him realize that perhaps the goal was not to make the story complete, but to learn how to live with those unfinished parts, without trying to hide them, without trying to turn them into something more acceptable, but accepting that they were part of who he was, and in that acceptance, even if it was not a perfect ending, at least Bruce Springsteen was no longer running from his own story. He stopped, looked straight at it, and for the first time did not try to change it, but simply accepted that this was his life. After facing his own story, without trying to edit or justify it anymore, Bruce Springsteen stepped into the years after turning 70 with a different mindset, no longer the man running forward with the same intensity as before, but someone who had understood that there were things that could not be overcome by speed or willpower. Yet that did not mean he stopped, because stopping had never been something he knew how to do. He still stepped onto the stage, still stood in front of the audience, still raised the songs that had followed him his whole life. But if you looked closely, you could see that the man standing on that stage was no longer the same as before, no longer an unlimited exploding source of energy, no longer the person who could run, jump, and sing for hours without stopping, but someone who carried caution, restraint, and a clear awareness of his own limits in every step. The performances now were no longer a place to prove something, no longer a race against himself or against others' expectations, but became a space where he tried to maintain connection, to maintain meaning, to maintain a part of himself he did not want to lose. Bruce no longer chased success because he had already had so much, and he also understood that success could not fill the empty spaces inside. What he sought now was not new peaks, but balance, a state where he could continue without losing himself once again, and to achieve that, he had to learn acceptance, to accept that there were things that could not be changed, that his body was no longer what it once was, that the years that had passed could not be brought back, that the wounds from the past would not disappear just because he understood them, and this acceptance did not come easily. It was not a one-time decision, but a repeated process. Every day, every time he felt the urge to go back to the old way, to push himself beyond limits, to prove he was still the same, he had to remind himself that it was no longer necessary, that his worth did not lie in how much he could do, but in how honestly he could continue. Bruce carried the past in every step, not as a burden to be thrown away, but as an inseparable part. The memories of childhood, of family, of mistakes, of losses, they were all still there, not disappearing, but they no longer controlled him the way they once did. He no longer tried to defeat the pain, no longer tried to push it away, because he had understood it was a battle without an end, and trying to win only exhausted him more. Instead, he learned to live with it. Like an unwanted companion he could not leave behind. There were days when it became clearer and heavier. There were days when it retreated and gave him room to breathe. But no matter the state, he no longer ran from it. no longer pretended it did not exist. And it was in that change, even if it was not complete healing, that a form of growth he had never had before emerged. When he stood on stage now, it was no longer to become a symbol, but to continue a dialogue, not only with the audience, but with himself. Each song was no longer a declaration, but an acknowledgement that he was still here. Not perfect, not whole, but still continuing. And perhaps that was the most honest thing he could offer. Not the image of someone who had overcome everything, but the image of someone still walking forward, even knowing the road would never become easier. After everything he had been through, when looking back at Bruce Springsteen's entire journey, what emerged was not a perfect success story, nor a complete tragedy drowned in darkness, but a life existing between two opposite poles, where light and darkness did not exclude each other, but coexisted, intertwined, shaping the man in a way no title could capture. He had stood on the world's biggest stages, had heard millions singing along to his lyrics, had become an irreplaceable part of many generations' memories, but at the same time he had walked through silences no one saw, nights with no music, no lights, only facing himself and questions that never had clear answers. And perhaps the hardest thing to accept was not what had happened, but realizing there was no point in the journey where everything became whole, no moment when he could say he was completely okay, that all the broken parts inside had been mended, because the truth was, there were wounds that did not disappear with time. They only changed the way they existed, becoming quieter, less obvious, but still there, and continuing to live was not about erasing them, but about learning to adapt to their presence. Bruce understood that success, no matter how great, had no power to save the parts that had been damaged from very early on. It could not go back and change the childhood years, could not repair the broken relationships, could not make the initial feelings of lack disappear. It only created a shell, a different setting where those things continued to exist in a new form. And that was why music for him had never been a solution. It was not a way to heal completely, but a way to prolong existence, to transform what could not be spoken into melodies that at least could be shared and partially understood. Each song was not an answer, but a question posed in a way others could feel. And in that process, Bruce not only helped others feel less alone, but also found a way to continue without completely sinking into the inner emptiness. Yet that did not make the emptiness disappear. It only made it bearable, and that was a very big difference because it meant he did not live in a healed state, but in a state that always required balance, always required adjustment, always required awareness of what was happening inside him. Bruce Springsteen, in that way, existed between two worlds, one where he was a legend, where he was celebrated and loved, where everything seemed to have clear meaning, and another world where he was just a man trying to understand himself, trying to live with the parts he could not change, and the distance between those two worlds never completely disappeared. It only became more familiar over time, until he learned to move between them without being pulled entirely to one side. And perhaps that was the closest thing to balance he could achieve. Not an absolutely stable state, but the ability to continue even without certainty. When he stepped onto the stage at 70 or 76, that image was no longer simply a performing artist, but a man carrying his entire story, every step, every lyric containing what he had been through. Not to prove anything, but simply to continue. Because some people step onto the stage because they are ready, because they have overcome. But there are also people who step onto the stage because it is the only way they know to exist. And Bruce belonged to the second group. He did not sing because everything was okay. He sang because music was the only place where he could set down what was too heavy to carry alone. And in that final image, when the lights shone down, when the music played, when a man stood there with everything he had been and everything he could never become, there was no perfect ending, no complete explanation, only a simple but hard-to-accept truth. that there are lives not defined by having healed, but by how they continued when they could never fully heal. And Bruce Springsteen, after all, still stood there, not because he had found the answers, but because he had never learned how to stop. The story of Bruce Springsteen not only makes people admire him, but also leaves a very deep sadness, because it shows that even people standing at the peak of fame can still carry wounds that never heal. From the boy who grew up in a house full of silence with a cold father, where he learned to shrink himself to survive, to the man standing in front of tens of thousands of fans but still feeling empty after every show. All of it creates a journey that is both grand and painful, especially details like the marriage to Julianne Phillips that broke not because of conflict, but because of the lack of presence, or the nights when he had to turn to therapy to keep from sinking deeper into depression, clearly showing that success has no power to save the parts that were broken from the inside. And it is precisely his choice to stay, his choice to continue being a father and a husband beside Patti Scialfa, his choice to step onto the stage even when his body was no longer the same. That is the most honorable thing, not because he defeated the pain, but because he did not let it end his life. For American audiences, this story reflects a very familiar truth in American culture. Society can celebrate success but often forgets mental health. And the lesson here is not to become strong like a symbol, but to learn to face oneself honestly, to dare to seek help the way Bruce did, and to understand that a person's worth does not lie in never falling, but in still continuing to walk forward even while carrying wounds that never disappear. If the story of Bruce Springsteen touched you, please hit subscribe and leave a like as a way to appreciate a man who never stopped standing firm, even while carrying wounds that never heal. Thank you for listening until the end, and see you in the next video, where we will continue to explore the stories behind the spotlight that not everyone has the courage to tell.